good morning or good afternoon, wherever everybody is located. I am Drew Prohaska. I'm the marketing manager for DEKRA Safety Management Systems, and I'm going to be covering a few housekeeping items before we get started here, and then I will turn it over to our presenters. So first of all, hopefully everybody is staying safe and healthy out there during these times. A couple things to get started. Everybody is in listen only mode, which means everybody is automatically muted. So if you have any questions during this presentation, you'll find a questions box in your control panel for the webinar. Type any questions you have into that box, and we will try to address those questions at the end of the webinar. We're going to give a little bit of time when our presenters finish up. And this webinar is being recorded, so everybody who is attending the webinar will receive a recording of this presentation in an email about a day after this webinar wraps up. So today we're going to have Joe Melton, who is the Director of Safety Consulting Services for DEKRA Safety Management Systems, and one of our Senior Safety Consultants, Corey Hopkins, talking on how to write a proper lockout tagout procedure. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, Drew. This is Joe Melton here. Glad everyone's able to join us today. We'll just get right into our agenda. Kind of our target audience here is to really help and assess those frontline operation individuals, supervisors, managers, who don't always have the confidence nor the skill development in their career paths in writing lockout tagout procedures. Each facility's complexity, personnel skill is different. So it's important in this process to remember what's going to work for you. So our background, from my perspective, and I'll let Corey Hopkins come in and give his background, experience, and knowledge. And what we're going to try to share today is, for me personally, being involved in safety for the last 12 years, helping organizations not only manage their lockout tagout programs, but also assisting and writing, just north about 12, 15,000 procedures myself. So I'm going to try to give some experience of, when I have helped organizations write their procedures, review them, and in that process, we do it from a place as a teacher. When we're on site working with the operations personnel, the supervisors, the managers, and EHS team, trying to do it in a manner where, the parable, teach a man to fish. And that's kind of our philosophy within DEKRA. So with that, Corey, go ahead and please introduce yourself and kind of your background.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Joe. Yep. My name is Corey Hopkins. I have been in safety, started in safety since 1999. So I've been most of my career right in the front lines and being a safety manager, compliance coordinator, whatever you want to call it, but have been involved with writing lockout procedures for several years now. And I guess from my perspective, having been, in the front lines on this, is remember the goal of any procedure or any lockout procedure is to effectively lock that piece of equipment out and make sure it won't start while someone's working on it. So we got to make sure that the procedures are written in a fashion that are, is easy enough for a frontline operator or individual to use and follow easily, and it also needs to be effective. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. And the other thing to keep in mind, because I have that safety manager background, is, I didn't spend a lot of time like in the front line doing maintenance or locking out equipment before getting into the safety role. So as a safety manager, I even needed help and training. So it's really a great way to involve your employees in writing these procedures to make sure that they're, written properly and they're going to effectively lock it out. So I hope to be able to share that information with you today. So take it away, Joe.
Yeah, so the agenda of what we're going to cover when you're doing lockout tagout procedures is first and foremost, we need to be within the standards and the requirements of OSHA and other regulatory bodies. So for the purpose of our go-to webinar today, we will be laying out the steps that you can find in the OSHA guidance documents on their website. So we'll lay through also the best practices between Corey and I's experiences of what we've picked up on making this the most useful for your frontline operators, but also putting a personalized touch on it. So we're going to show a few different examples that we've picked up over the years to try to share with you on personalizing your procedures in a way that works best for the complexity of your location, operations, and personnel skill and development. We also will review different energy sources we want to keep in mind as we're writing the procedures and testing our procedures, but also we're going to touch on periodic inspections and the importance of that portion of the requirement within the OSHA standards. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started here, Corey. So the standard is laid out in OSHA General Industry 1910-147. If you've never spent time on the OSHA website, it is part of the Department of Labor. It's a fairly pretty easy portion of the website to get through. You see the search box. So if you get to the Department of Labor and you want to, search out a certain standard specifically for lockout tagout, what I will do in just my simple Google box is OSHA 1910 lockout tagout. If you don't know the exact number, it'll pull it up and take you right to this page. So specifically we want to highlight here is the scope and purpose of lockout tagout. Why did OSHA get involved in regulating that portion? And it goes back to the 147A, section 1I, that this standard is going to cover servicing and maintenance of machines and equipment in which unexpected energy or start machines or equipment are released or stored energy could harm employees. This standard establishes the minimum performance requirements for the control of such hazardous energy. So it's just a good reminder that the OSHA standards are the minimum requirement and that going above and beyond is okay for your environment. So as we lay out these next portions, we'll be following the steps of, we want to prepare for lockout tagout. So as you're writing your procedures and you're looking at the step-by-steps, what's the preparation process? What's our shutdown process? What's the process for isolation and communication? And then getting into the lockout tagout portion, checking for stored energy, and isolation verification. These are the 6 steps that are laid out in the OSHA standards for us. So this is the guidelines that we will be following step by step through the process. So as you're writing your procedures, these are the things we want to make sure that they are entailed, that they are machine specific for that specific machine or equipment. So with that, Corey, let's go ahead and get into preparation here. So before they start repair and maintenance, go ahead and go over the steps we have laid out for them, Corey.
Okay. Obviously, this is, as Joe mentioned, you want to do this before you start. You want to review the lockout program or procedure. There should be a equipment-specific procedure for each piece of equipment or machinery. So you want to review that procedure. Notify all affected employees of the procedure or of the lockout. So my initial experience was at a soybean processing plant, and we had a maintenance crew that was there all day. So when they were there during the days, they were always in a different room performing maintenance on equipment that normally ran 24/7. So they would obviously have to notify the operator of the room they were in. We had one room called the prep department where soybeans were prepared for extraction. So they'd have to shut off crackers or flakers to do maintenance on them. So obviously that affects the whole flow of the program. So the notify all affected employees is kind of what that refers to. And then let them know that you're going to be servicing or maintenance and what you're going to be doing, how long that equipment needs to be shut down, and what's going to be happening. So that way the individuals that could be affected or the whole process that could be affected, there's a clear communication line.
One tip as well that I would lay out here in this step, Corey, is the importance of communicating that lockout tagout's being performed to their immediate supervisors. For the ones that are performing the lockout tagout, one tip that I would, as you're writing your procedures in this preparation portion, is include getting a different set of eyes, that supervisor, that manager type, to ask the question, why are we doing lockout tagout in the first place? What can we do to mitigate potentially not needing to do this lockout tagout? Having someone ask those questions, a supervisor or manager of that nature, that all the proper procedures and thought process has been laid out.
Joe, I would also add that this may be one of those personalization things. I've worked at facilities where you had to have approval from a supervisor in order to lock equipment out. So, it kind of depends on what you have at your facility and what your rules are, but keep that in mind as well. There may be other notifications that need to happen.
And I think when we get to our examples, Corey, within the personalization, that we'll see a few of the examples highlight the importance of that supervisory role. And so I think we'll cover that as well, like you said, in the personalization portion. Then once we get out of preparation, we're into the shutdown mode. So as you're writing your procedures and we're trying to guide those individuals through the shutdown process, that the authorized employee shall refer to the company procedures to identify the type and the magnitude of the energy. So this is right out of the OSHA manual here. So what we're saying is that we need to write in a way that's specific for that piece of equipment, not writing a procedure that over umbrellas all your conveyors at the facility. That you're writing a procedure for each individual conveyor that's specialized for that piece of equipment and for each of their specialized energies that are operating that equipment or machinery. And that we shall understand the hazards of the energy. So this goes back to the annually required lockout tagout training, and why the onboarding portion of training and lockout tagout is so critical, that employees understand if they're affected or if they are unauthorized. If they're unauthorized personnel, then we need to ensure through our training and our hands-on portion that they understand the full magnitude of what that energy can do. And then if the machine or equipment is operating, shut it down by the normal shutdown process, and be sure to consider all start-stop locations if there's multiple points of potential shutdown.
Hey, and on that, Joe, that third bullet I threw into this presentation because of previous experience. And back to the soy plant, we had 3 main bulk storage tanks for soybean meal. And there was one main conveyor for our loadouts. We had a loadout for rail and a loadout for trucks. And there was actually a start button in 2 different rooms about a block apart in the facility that would operate that. So we actually had that occur once where somebody started the conveyor from a different spot. They had tried the verification process from the truck loadout and it didn't work, but somebody started that conveyor from the rail loadout. So the procedure was not effective, and we had to make some adjustments because of and you'll notice too in that second bullet point, some of this is dated. Start stop buttons and switches are becoming less popular and more of a computer start stop station. So make sure that whatever your normal start stop station is, whether that's a PLC computer based spot or actual start stop button, make sure that that's spelled out in your procedure.
And I believe that Drew covered this at the introduction, but we did have a question come through. Our slides will be made available to you. Drew will cover at the end how those will be sent out. So if you're taking rigorous notes and those such things, that Corey and I were both raised on the those secrets in safety. There were some very patient people along the way that helped mold and educate us along the way. So we're not big on the keeping secrets. So these slides will be made available to you, and Drew can kind of cover that at the end here. So as we move into the next step of isolation, it's important that we deactivate the energy, isolating the devices so that the machine or equipment is isolated from the potential energy sources. And in the next slide, Corey will kind of expand on the different types of energy sources from a standpoint of potential gravity, pneumatic, mechanical, but electrical is the one that usually and typically comes to mind, but there's so many other sources. And this is why in the previous slide, the onboarding process of educating your new employees, even if they have a background in maintenance, that the complexity of your operations is important, that they understand the energy sources and respect those energy sources. And this is where the released all stored energy really comes heavily into play. So as you're writing your procedures, that you're laying it out specifically at this point in time, that once it has been identified what the energy source is that we are bleeding or dissipating those potential energy sources, so we don't have an unexpected release from those energy sources. And Corey, I'll go ahead and go to energy sources, and you can take it away.
All right, thanks, Joe. So yeah, this is kind of where the technical side of Lockout comes in, and you really have to pay attention to details, because as Joe mentioned, obviously electrical energy is the primary kind of source, and that's what, you know, most equipment is operated by an electrical motor, but not everything. So you have to make sure that you're considering all the different energy sources there may be. So chemical, electrical, hydraulic energy, mechanical, pneumatic, thermal, and even gravity is a source of energy. And then there's, you know, it could be based on whatever your equipment is, there could be other sources as well. But I kind of go back to that gravity. I do recall an incident where we had, or it actually wasn't at my site, but there was another site where they had a leg that was being worked on, a grain leg, and the cups were filled with grain, and as they were working on it, they had failed to, I guess, anticipate the fact that that belt could still move even though it was locked out and the electrical energy was isolated. The belt moved, and an individual amputated the tip of his finger when it was caught in between the a cup and the sidewall. So those other sources of energy need to be considered whenever you're writing these procedures.
That's good explanation, Corey. Thanks for sharing that. And we get into our fourth step here, Corey, on the actual lockout of the energy isolation device and the importance of assigning individual locks. There was a point in time where the lockout tagout locks were provided 2 keys. So this is kind of the technical portion of the standard that we want to issue 1 key. And in your lockout tagout program, stepping a little bit outside of the procedures here that we're discussing, you want to have a portion for handling the removal of locks in the case of not being able to identify the lock owner and their key. So having that portion in your lockout tagout program is important. And on the lockout equipment, you know, your hasps, your breaker locks and valve locks and gang locking, and all of those equipment, having those dedicated and available for the individuals.
And I'll just add on to that, Joe, is from past experience. Now, everyone on the call may agree or not agree with me on this, but I'm going to share personal experience on this one. As Joe mentioned, there is a technical part of the standard that says you can have a key to unlock an individual's lock. And at the soybean plant, we issued 6 lockouts to each maintenance individual because it was pretty complex in that facility, and sometimes you had to lock out multiple items in order to work on one particular machine. So we did have a second key for their lockouts, but it was maintained in my office, and it was in a locked box, so it was isolated so no one else could get to it. But we were cutting off so many locks with bolt cutters based on, you know, somebody forgetting to take their lock out at the end of the day or whatever. So we did do that. And then the other thing, as far as assigning individual locks, some people just kind of have general lock boxes in their MCC rooms. And what I found with those is we typically had a lot of locks and hasps and labels, cards, you know, tags that were missing, and the supply was always a challenge to maintain. So we did give individuals assigned locks with their names on it, and they were responsible for maintaining those. And then, you know, it did probably cost a little more up front to give each employee each authorized employee their individual locks. But in the long run, it helped us with maintaining supply and making sure that people were accountable for their locks. So that's all I had to share on that one, Joe.
Yep. Thanks, Corey. And this is the portion as you're writing your procedures that we really want to hammer home, that lock tag test. So that stored energy checking at this portion. So as you're writing your procedures, highlighting this portion, hammering home in your trainings. Corey and I have both conducted lockout, tagout technical trainings. And this is the portion that we both really want to hit home with them, that you're verifying that what you locked out actually has dissipated that energy. Go and try to start it. And I've heard some absolute horror stories in my career of doing mock OSHA style audits, that a person will come up and say, oh, we thought we locked it out. We went and started it and it ran. And there's a secondary electrical energy source going to that motor. And those are the things that in this step that's critical. Try to start it, try to run it. As Corey said, go to the computer, hit the start, see if it runs. If it does, don't do the maintenance. Go back and review the procedures, try to understand why there's a secondary energy source there. So this is really hypercritical that the operators and your frontline operations understand that once the lock is put on, make no assumptions, really try to start it and run it and hammer that home in your procedures. And the last portion here is the isolation verification. So just the last step in communicating to all personnel that the covers are coming off. You're going to begin doing the maintenance on it. So ensure that all personnel are clear of the equipment. Verify that it will not start. That is super critical here, that it will not start in the normal starting process. And that the machine and equipment is now locked out and it can begin performing the maintenance repairs.
You see that asterisk down below is when you do your verification step, that may involve turning a switch to the on position. Make sure that you remember to turn it back off before you start the maintenance, because when you go to restart the equipment, if you have that in the on position, it's going to take off right when you throw the breaker up. So,
and that is a piece that, Corey, that I would encourage our listeners, and that is something that is specifically laid out in your procedures, that they've locked it, they've tested it, they've talked to you're laying it out step by step, and then that final portion is return the equipment startup, switches, control panel, whatever it is, to the neutral or off position. Have that specifically laid out for them. And you'll see this when we get to the personalization portion of how that can be accomplished in a few different manners. And the next slide, Corey, that we have is straight from the return to service 1 through 5, kind of checkbox right from the 1910-147 standard here. But after the maintenance has been returned, these 5 portions we want to include in your procedures.
Yep. And number 1 is pretty important. If you're doing maintenance, make sure all tools are out of that equipment. I know I've seen it before where someone left a tool and it ended up in a conveyor and in the process that caused a lot of issues. So making sure that all those non-essential items and tools have been removed and that the equipment is operationally intact and ready to go.
And the second bullet there, you see that all employees have been safely positioned or removed from the area. Verifying once again that the controls are in neutral, going back to Corey's point, removing the lockout devices, removal of the forms of blocking as well for gravity as an example that Corey gave earlier, and then notifying all affected that the servicing and maintenance has been completed and the machine equipment is ready for use, that final communication piece. So Corey, let's get into what they all tuned in for, the actual writing of the procedures.
Yep. You just want to make sure that these procedures are detailed and understandable. It can be pretty intimidating sometimes for especially a newer frontline employee that may not be, depending on what they're doing, they may not be real understanding of the regulations, or they may not be a person that likes to read procedures and follow them. So you have to make sure that it's easy to understand and that it's effective. So and like that second bullet point says, write it so that if any person came on and never been to your site before could follow it. Make it that easy. And then the third one is one that's, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, and I was going to say on that one, we'll get into our personalization portion, but you'll see some poor examples I've seen when I'm reviewing lockout tagout procedures, Corey, that a person will write in there when locking out leg 1, go to electrical room, and that's it. And it's, well, where's the electrical room? Where do I go? So that to kind of expand on that second point there is, direct them exactly where to go, exactly where it is, exactly what it is. You make it, back to that detailed and that it's written in an understandable language. So if your process has a high complexity to it, maybe some abbreviations and bullet points and breakdowns. This is the complexity, and maybe this is the common language. Having both in there, and that can help that understandable portion. So,
yep.
Go ahead, Corey. With number 3 there, you were going.
Yep. In the safety world, we live on acronyms, and not everybody understands safety acronyms. So make sure it's spelled out so that a normal individual can understand it. And yeah, on the third bullet point, that's critical, that whatever your procedure states matches exactly what's on the NCC panel. Over my years in the safety world, I'll see something in the procedure that says, lock out the receiving leg panel. Then you go into the NCC room and it just says leg, or it just has a number on it, or it just has a faded label that no one can read. So you want to make sure that your procedures match exactly what that panel says, so that you don't have any confusion over which panel to lock out. So, and I think your point there on bullet 2, Joe, is kind of spelled out in bullet 4 here, where you're writing it, go to MCC on the west side of building number 2 on the north end of the complex, lockout panel number 132 labeled receiving leg. So that's very specific, pretty easy to understand, and it tells you exactly where to go and what to lock out. So, next slide for you, Joe.
One tip. Yep, I'll move right ahead. And I think this gets into your visual tips here of what you've picked up over your career. So go ahead and kind of share.
Yeah. Well, I guess this is just to my point. you see on the left there it says pump 4 tank, and it's a breaker with 3 different breakers on it. And what tank? It just says pump for tank. You want to be more specific. 110 breakers in panels are notorious for being labeled poorly or not labeled at all. So make sure that you analyze those, and you can see down below, that's a little better, or in the middle there where it says tanks 1, 2, bottom conveyor. That's a lot more clear label. And on the right there, that's actually from past experience where doing an audit at a facility, the labels on the right-hand side of those panels were what was there on the first audit, and obviously they're faded or illegible, not too good. And then the improvement was getting a label maker and making sure that we cleared it up and made sure that it was easily read and easily understandable. So that's a lot better labeling on the left-hand side of those panels. And then I would recommend removing the ones on the right-hand side. That would be my recommendation as well, so that it's clear and there's not 2 different labels stating 2 different things. You want to make it whatever it is, and if you use number system or whatever for your panels, that's fine as well, but just make sure it's clear and easy for someone to read and understand.
Well, I think that's a good point, Corey, is the way some of the lockout points may be labeled are a little differently than the floor language. So in your procedures, from a listing standpoint, you may have, a labeling system at your location that says LB1 leg, and that's how it is in your lockout, but everybody at the facility knows it as the concrete west leg. So you want to have that technical language in there, but also, and this is where it goes back to including the individuals that are closest to the risk and most familiar with it. Make sure that we're also including those common languages as well. Because you see here a local engine heater, there might be another common name for that as well. So we're including both of those in our procedures.
I think
so
too,
how do
Joe,
we
you bring up.
Go ahead, Corey.
Sorry, we're kind of walking on each other there, but you bring up a good point. Is I've worked at facilities in the past where they actually have nicknames for big storage tanks, like Big Bertha, for example. Sometimes, if that's what everybody knows something by, there's nothing wrong with putting in your procedure or on your panel, Big Bertha discharge conveyor. Use the common language so it's understandable to the employees. So that's it, Joe. Go ahead.
No problem. Thanks, Corey. So there is a technical portion within the standard, 1910-147, Section C, that includes here, as you see on the screen, the periodic inspection requirement. And before we get into the personalization, Corey and I wanted to hit on this because as we've conducted internal audits, external audits, inspections, and support from a consulting role, and in Corey's previous life in the safety manager, safety director roles, that this is the portion that commonly gets overlooked and missed, is that annual inspection, that procedure does what it says it's going to do, that it's actually been tested, that annually that those machine-specific procedures are doing what it's laid out to be done. And that is covered here in this section, that the employer shall conduct a periodic inspection of the energy control procedure at least annually to ensure the procedure and requirements of this standard are being followed. And to go a little further, Corey, I think you included the full breakdown of this section here. So if you go ahead and cover the highlights here.
You bet. A couple things I've been caught on in the past, or not caught on, but pointed out to me in my role, is that it needs to be performed by an authorized employee. So I think at one particular facility, I had tested a procedure and I had signed off on the annual periodic review, but I wasn't listed as that as an authorized employee. So that kind of dinged me on that one. And then also, when you do these periodic inspections, it says right in the standard there, and it's highlighted in the 1910-147C6IA, the periodic inspection shall be performed by an authorized employee other than the ones utilizing the energy control procedure being inspected. So that becomes a challenge, especially if you have multiple locations. You may have to bring individuals from a different location to do the annual inspection, because it's the people at that site are not the ones the people at that site, the ones that normally use the procedure, are not supposed to do these periodic inspections. So you have to be a little creative on that at times. And if you're a single facility, you may need to bring someone from a different department to do that inspection. So just keep that in mind. But then at the bottom there, you need to make sure that you certify that these inspections have been performed. So somehow you have to document it, I guess, is what it's boiling down to there. And we had a form that we created that did that. So, but yes, these annual periodic inspections need to be done. They need to be done by an authorized employee that is not the normal individual using that procedure. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and get into personalization. Looking at some of the questions coming in, Corey, I think we're going to be able to answer them here in this next portion. So we have a few different examples of why to personalize. You want to do what works for your facility and your employees. First and foremost, we need to include the standards. We need to be regulatory compliant. Once you've done that in your procedures, then you want to personalize it for what works, for the complexity of your location and industry, but also to the skill and understanding level of your employees, and to ensure that those procedures fit your needs. Back to the goal of what's the purpose of Lockout, Tagout. So, Corey, I'm going to go ahead and get into the first example and let you kind of explain from your experience and highlights of different ways to look at it.
Yeah, so as I think Joe mentioned, in safety, a lot of times people are perfectly okay with beg, borrow, and steal. So this is an example that was shared with me at one point with another safety manager, and he had created his own lockout templates. And you can see here that he included pictures, which is really kind of nice. It makes things easy for some people are just visual learners, and if they can see a picture of what they're supposed to lock out, it's just very helpful for them. So he just had this template made, and it shows you how to stop or start the item. So this is a PLC based screen there, and it tells you how to lock it out, and it actually shows you what you're supposed to lock out. Then it describes the source of energy, how to rotate it, apply locks and lock out on that right-hand picture. But this is just a template he used, showing how to lock something out. And like I said, the visuals are really nice. So go ahead and move to the next slide, Joe.
Well, before I move on, Corey, if you look at the bottom there, I really like how he's highlighted the approved by. Corey and I have talked about the supervisory role in this process. So in his form, he has it laid out for who is ultimately from a supervisory position is taking that responsibility for who's approving that lockout tagout. So we'll go ahead and go to your next one here, Corey.
Good point. Thanks, Joe. Keep me in line, Joe. All right, so this next one shows you the lockout, try it out, and lockout removal, kind of a checklist item there. And then down below it, he used visuals again to show you the energy source, the location, the lockout method, how to actually lock it out, and how to verify it. So it's just kind of a nice little chart that he used to make this an easy visual for someone to understand. Okay, I think next slide, Joe, unless you have something on this one. And this happened to be a bag conveyor. What I like about this one, if you look at the task-specific lockout requirements, and you'll see it in his next ones as well, that he kind of lays out some of the common tasks and whether or not a lockout is required for those, and what to lock out. So you can see they're removing broken bags from the conveyor, lock out that guard area entry run, and you don't have to lock out the E1 item there. So he just kind of spelled it out to tell you with the various tasks what you actually need to lock out. So, okay, anything on that one? There we go. And this happened to be the same individual, but he's worked at a couple different places. This was at a potato processing facility. I think they made all different kinds of tater tots and those kind of hash browns and things like that. So again, he showed the energy sources and some steam valves shown there. They're numbered, the different tasks that they use or typically do with that particular equipment, and whether or not each of those items needed to be locked out. Just a real simple visual template here. More of the same. Steam condensate drop number 1. Very, very specific with his naming and his numbering system on the valves. And then, you know, the various sources, he's got them all listed there, and the task and whether or not each one needs to be locked out. So and that's a gravity block. So that's you know, we mentioned gravity as a source of energy. Tells you exactly what to do. Step 1, rotate the hydraulic disconnect to line up the hole with the handle and the hole in the bracket, and then lockout verification, verify isolation by observing that the van, mark, Brussels, and auger are no longer running. And then it gives you step 2 there to show you how to put your hasp and multi-lock on a box in that particular case. So he's considering all the different energy sources here, which is nice. Okay, and here's another example of a lockout procedure. A little bit more complex, but it is effective. And it's procedure for locking out C6. What kind of tasks are typically done? It's repair, maintenance, and inspection. Depending on the task being performed, there may be other equipment. So you see below, there are some other equipment associated with this particular item that need to be locked out in order to safely work on that. Dryer number 4, number 5, and number 6. Also, there's interlocked equipment. And you see there it says interlocked equipment L3. Joe, I'll quiz you. Why is it important to list interlocked equipment? We'll see if you pass the quiz here. You there, Joe?
Oh, that helps if I pulled myself off mute for you there.
Okay.
So.
You want me to answer for you?
Take it away, Corey.
I'll go ahead. Yeah. So interlocked equipment, the reason that has to be listed is if you remember, one of the steps for lockout is the verification process, right? So you're going to go try to start that piece of equipment by pressing the start button. If you press the start button and it doesn't start, you've got it locked out properly, right? Well, that's where the interlocking equipment comes in. Is if that interlocked equipment is shut off at the current time, that may be the reason why that verification you're trying to do isn't working. So in other words, that interlocked equipment is off, so your piece of equipment won't start because the interlocked equipment is off. So in order to properly verify your lockout, you have to have that interlocked piece of equipment running so that when you verify, you try to start the item, it doesn't start. You know it's because you have it isolated and locked out properly. I hope I said that clear enough. If you have any questions, let me know. But Joe, do you want to expound on that?
One of the things too, Corey, that's been highlighted one of our other consultants that's on the call is when you're above, you see that there's C6. If there's a regional language to it, so sometimes you may have a piece of equipment called a turn head in one region of the country, and then in another region they may call it a distributor. That you're putting your regional culturalisms in play as well. That's where it's important, especially from a corporate standpoint, if procedures being written, that you're including the site personnel and still in the regional differences as well. And I think you've done a good job of that here, Corey, especially when you get into step number 5, specifically laying out the disconnect as the dry corn conveyor.
Sure. And like after that interlock, you see the energy type. There's kind of a chart here: energy type, the location, the name of the disconnect, the location start stop button, and the type of control device. Those are all requirements in the standard to make sure that you have those. And then yes, you go into the sequence of lockout, as Joe mentioned. If you recall, there was 6 steps in the OSHA mandatory regulatory requirements, and this particular location has 8 steps listed. So as long as you meet those 6 requirements, you can make this sequence fit whatever your facility is. So it's all pretty much the same, but if you look at that lockout energy number 5, it tells you the location of the electrical room, the disconnect, and the name, and actually has a number there, and then what type of energy control device. And then of course there's the restoring equipment to service down on the bottom as well. Once you have the maintenance done or repair done, you want to follow that sequence. Now I think you go to the next slide, Joe, and you've got a little different example of it.
Yeah, as I go to the next slide, Corey, we have a question that came in. If you have multiple conveyors, this says conveyor number 6, and the question is, if you have multiple conveyors, say 12 conveyors, and you perform the periodic inspection on this particular machine, do you then need to do all the other conveyors, or is just doing the periodic inspection for one suffice?
Okay, well, I'll do my best at trying to answer that. The requirement is that you do a periodic inspection on each piece of equipment. And so if you're, is that what you're referring to as periodic inspections?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So, but the standard does allow for grouping. So I'm not going to give you the full context of grouping, but I'll give you an example. Is if there are multiple fans, let's say aeration fans on a grain bin, if you have multiple fans and they all are locked out in the same fashion, you can test that, like one of the fans, and as long as that procedure works, you can consider that effective for all of your fans if they're all written the same way. I don't want to get in trouble telling you can do some people get pretty creative on grouping, so you want to make sure that it's exactly the same, and that the procedures are exactly the same. So that's the short answer, I guess.
I think that does it
to the grouping.
I think that answers what they were after, Corey. And we haven't set it up to this point, but I would also encourage, as we see, we have over 100 different registrants here from all over the country. Is Corey and I live in Iowa, so if you ever have a question, go back to your local OSHA offices for interpretation. There's a resource. If you're in a federal region, reach out to those individuals for clarity on grouping, as well as each region and state programs may interpret that just slightly differently at times. And that's highlighted here in this form. As you see at the top of this form, in procedure type, in this example, this local area office wanted the purpose and consequences on each procedure. So this just highlights this procedure type reflects that local area office and what they were looking for. That each procedure, machine-specific procedure, has the company's purpose of lockout tagout in the company's disciplinary process if Lockout Tagout is intentionally not followed, and what the consequences of not following the procedures. So this just gives an example of it. And in our last example here shows a step-by-step, but also a two-form process where the checklist is also available for those that like to have on hand more of a checklist portion. And you see that highlighted here is it can walk a person through, whether it's a contractor or internal personnel, step by step, reviewing the Lockout Tagout procedures before the project, notifying all affected employees that we're turning off the piece of equipment, that we've identified the breaker panel and power sources, but really getting specific in number 5 there, where you're specifically leading the person to the control room, located on the west of the leg, on the east wall, specifically telling the individuals that are performing the lockout that it's the top row of switches, the furthest to the right. Disconnect for the leg is located on the west control room, is attached to the east control room, is located on the east wall on the left side. So this does a really good job of thoroughly laying out in that process. And you see the 3 sections now they're able to perform. And at the top, you see there is a signature for supervisory authorization. So we've highlighted that several times now, and in the importance. So this is taking example 2 and putting it into a little bit of a checklist portion if you like that personalization for your site and complexity. So I think that answers those questions that have come in, Corey. So
yeah,
I
see one question, Joe, that I kind of want to clarify. We talked about the periodic inspections of lockout procedures, right? And that is the intent of that is to make sure that these procedures work. Okay, there's another requirement, and that is on your authorized individuals, evaluating them to make sure that they know how to perform a lockout. And that's a whole different story. That's more of a personnel training or employee training piece. I don't know if you have any input on that, Joe, on making sure that you have a list of authorized individuals at your site and that they've each been evaluated. I don't think you have to, have each of them do an inspection on all the different equipment. You're going to evaluate that individual on one lockout to make sure that they have an understanding of how lockout works. But that's a whole different thing than the annual inspections of equipment procedures. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, and that's an important part of developing your culture within your organization at your site, from a coaching and education standpoint, that your authorized are being observed and inspected annually, that they're able to perform, and if they're not, then we need to get them to the standard in which, or not have them as authorized individuals anymore.
All right. You want me to go ahead with this one, Joe? All right. Conclusion. Procedures need to meet regulatory requirements. Obviously, that's a minimum, as Joe mentioned. They must be specific and understandable. As we mentioned, personalize them for your facility, according to the complexity and your personnel skills. That can vary from location to location, industry to industry, site to site. So make sure that it is going to fit the complexity and the skills of your personnel. And then the periodic inspections, we mentioned they're often overlooked, overdue, and underappreciated. So, and there's a reason they have them on an annual basis. Work gets done at sites. Not always are the changes communicated. A lot of people in the past, I would say 10 to 20 years, have undergone major upgrades at their facility when it comes to electrical and automation, things like that. So the OSHA standard recognizes that changes happen and that they don't always get communicated properly, and procedures aren't always updated when they need to be updated. So that's why there's an annual requirement. So those periodic inspections, they definitely need to be maintained and kept up on. And they need to be performed by an authorized employee, and it needs to be someone other than the typical employee using that procedure. So hopefully we made those points clear for you today.
So I think the questions that have come in, Corey, we've answered them as we went through. There's no new questions that have come in. If there are any additional questions, please ask them. We're going to go ahead and tie up our loose ends here. In our next upcoming webinar in this series, this is a series of 4 different webinars we're going to be offering over the next 4 weeks to help break up the monotony of your day through the COVID-19. We'd like to see you join us in our next 3. We will be incorporating a new technology of mobile polling through Turning Point Technologies is who we utilize. So in the next 3 webinar series, we will be sending out ahead of time instructions for the free app. It has no cost to you, and how you can follow along and utilize that tool to help guide our next webinars we have come up. And with that, Corey, I'm going to go ahead and display the next week. We have on April 15th at the same time, how to prepare your facility for a regulatory inspection. So Corey has years and years of experience working with different regulatory agencies firsthand, and we'll be utilizing those experiences.
Yes, we'll try to give you the kind of boilerplate items as far as getting prepared for regulatory inspection, but then we'll also talk about real world and how to prepare for some of the things you might not anticipate.
So if you have facility personnel, supervisors, managers, such that you'd like to have registered for that one, go ahead and pass that along to them. And then in 2 weeks, we will have the behavior-based safety observation versus conversation and reviewing from the coaching role standpoint. So we'll be instilling a lot of data and research into that one as well. No new questions have come in, Corey. It looks like we are coming right up on our noon Central Time hour here. So I will end with our contact information. Reach out to Corey or myself. You can also access our website and reach out that way. Any specific questions, anything we can do to help your process. Drew will be sending out the completed portion of our PowerPoint, and you can reach out to us that way as well. Thanks, Ted.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And with that being said as well, everybody who attended this webinar will also receive further registration links. You can visit the website that was listed in Joe's PowerPoint there. But the registration links for the next upcoming webinars will also be sent to you as well. So in your follow-up emails, be looking for the presentation PowerPoints, a recording of this webinar, and also registration links for the next and upcoming webinar series. All right, well, if nobody else has any other questions, doesn't look like anything's coming in. Thank you, Joe and Corey, for putting on that presentation today, and we will wrap it up. So everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and we will talk to you next week.
Thanks.